Trade tensions will likely dominate discussions at this week's World Economic Forum on Africa. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says the trade war between the US and China is affecting everyone negatively.
He says there is hope that discussions at the forum will send a strong message that the trade tensions are not helpful. South Africa will this week host the World Economic Forum on Africa under the theme Shaping Inclusive Growth and Shared Futures in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The conference brings together leaders representing governments, business, civil society and academia.
Top of the agenda being new partnerships to create sustainable employment opportunities for Africa's large and growing workforce. Briefing the media ahead of the conference, Mboweni said the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement presents great opportunities for South Africa and the continent at large.
He, however, says the current global trade tensions are not helping matters.
The biggest issue which forms part of the background to the meeting is the global trade tensions which are consuming the world. The trade war between the US and China is not helpful. It's affecting the markets generally. Whether it's the commodity markets or the currency markets. So the issue of the trade wars and these trade tensions is a very important one for us. And I'm quite certain that during the conversations, this issue will keep coming to the fore in order that the message must get through, particularly to those people in Washington, that these trade wars are not helpful to us and to the global economy, and that the quicker these issues are dealt with, the better. Elsie mentioned the very important signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, an agreement which for South Africa is a gift of the gods, in that South Africa stands to benefit far more from the African Intercontinental Free Trade Area, African Continental Free Trade Area. Very long. We stand to gain tremendously from this because of our industrial base. So the largest industrial park in Africa, being Ekurhuleni, is going to benefit the most out of this through the production and export of manufactured goods. So we very much appreciate this. Against this background of these trade wars, nevertheless, Africans are organizing themselves into the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So we appreciate that very much.
For more on this story, we joined via Skype by Economist Viv Govender. A very good evening to you, Viv. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, ostensibly, one of the sticking points of the upcoming World Economic Forum on Africa will be the ongoing US-China trade war. So how do you envisage that this will be discussed at the upcoming WEF?
Unfortunately, this will be discussed the same way like Manchester United fans discuss what's happening with the sidelines. This is primarily a US-driven decision. The Chinese would be more than happy to come to a reasonable agreement with the US to basically cut this US-led trade war against China. Unfortunately, it plays very well with the US electorate at the moment, and at least until I think we get close to next year's election in the US, the presidential election, or until we see quite a substantial pullback in the US growth rate, I think that's going to be something that the US president views as being a trump card, to pardon the pun, in his deck, to show that he's a very strong, anti-China, pro-US president, fighting the evil Chinese while stealing American jobs, etc. So, like I said, this is, even though we in the world, the rest of the world, are going to be suffering because of the trade issues, I mean, the impact that we have on these things are very limited, I would think.
Now, Viv, if an all-out trade war does eventually develop, God forbid, it's likely that China would reinforce its trade and investment partnerships with BRICS partners or BRICS member states, and of course expand its investment base in South Africa. So won't this fuel fire into the concerns that China is recolonizing Africa?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Chinese aren't recolonizing Africa, because we've got to... People use these terms in very lackadaisical ways, but I mean, doing business in the country is not colonizing it. Colonization is when you come in, you take what you want, you don't give the inhabitants a choice, and that's colonization. What the Chinese are doing is basically coming and offering business deals, and what we in Africa have to do is take the deals that suit us and basically refuse the deals that don't. It's requiring for us to take a long-term view. It's the difference, like I said, between going and buying a car and having your car hijacked. You know what I mean? Colonialism was hijacking. This is a case of you buying a car that might and might not be a good car. It's up to you to do due diligence to make sure that the deal that you make is good for you. But unlike, like I said, with colonialism, where you're seeing force and that sort of stuff being used, it's not being used by China. But the effects could be quite dramatic anyway. We could see a situation where if the deal's made up bad enough, or if our governments don't have the foresight to impose the right restrictions, to basically agree to the right terms, we could be saddled with debt. We could be saddled with obligations to China that could be very onerous to several African countries. But I mean, it's up to us to get into those discussions beforehand to basically decide what exactly we want from the deals and to make sure that we get at least a fair shake in terms of the benefits of any of these deals.
And how does the continent then synchronize the World Economic Forum on Africa with the recently launched African Continental Free Trade Area in ensuring greater and optimum beneficiation and economic spin-offs?
Well, it's this kind of stuff is hard to do top down. You get top down movements for beneficiation, etc. It's hard to do. But I think if you can basically remove some of these trade barriers between the different African countries, what you'll have is a market of, by the middle of the century of about 2,000 billion people. You'll have hopefully growth rates that are 4, 5, 6% plus for much of the continent. I think already of the top 40 or 50 countries in the world that are going fastest, majority of them are in Africa. You would basically have these things automatically happening. If there is a huge market, if there's huge growth rates, if the demand builds up, you don't have to have a government official telling towards African entrepreneurs to go out there and do these things. They will figure it out for themselves. That's the thing that the Chinese learned. They learned that if you basically get your hand off the till and you get to allow the average Chinese person to go out and basically compete in the global market, you'll be surprised how well they'll do. You just basically got to stop, trying to think that U.S. government know what you're doing better than anybody else. And privatization, opening up of markets, more liberalism in the economy is what actually got China to where it is right now. When they were more state controlled, when they had the Communist Party dictating how the economy worked, they were doing much, much worse. And that's a lesson we should need to learn as well. There's often these talks among government ministers about, putting forward these plans to do this and to that. And really, government ministers are not business people. If they ever had to start a business, I'd be surprised if they'd be more successful than average. But if you do basically allow the individual person out there to figure out what they want for themselves, generally you will find quite an active economic activity occurring.
Now, Viv, you will recall that just recently the World Economic Forum launched the Africa Growth Platform, which is an initiative aimed at helping startup enterprises grow and competing at an international level. And of these startups which have been doing remarkably well is the tech industry. And with Africa slowly grasping the promise of the fourth industrial revolution, we've seen over 400 tech hubs springing up all across the continent, with Nairobi and Lagos and Cape Town being recognized as the internationally recognized technology centers. But these initiatives, Viv, are at enterprise level or at city level rather than at integrated national level. So how will that adversely affect the continent?
Well, look, the example I would use, look at San Francisco. Basically, it's the hub of the tech world. And you look at whether or not having Google and having Facebook and having Twitter and having Apple all in that kind of area basically improves the social economic indicators for the area. And it doesn't really. The reason being is that these tech companies, these startup companies, don't really absorb, the labor force that you want them to absorb. I mean, they'll take the cream of the crop. I mean, with over 1 billion people, you're going to have massive amounts of genius out there. You give them the opportunity; those geniuses are going to go out and they create the next Facebook. They'll create the next YouTube. They'll create all these incredibly innovative products. But I mean, if you look at the example, for instance, when WhatsApp was bought by Facebook, I think there were less than 20 employees, and there was $1 billion plus, something ridiculous like that spent on this thing. Tech startups generate a lot of wealth. What they don't do is spread the wealth out to anybody else. You basically encourage tech startups in Africa. It will work. People will create. Many companies will be quite proud of the fact that we have listed $1 billion companies on the New York Stock Exchange or on the NASDAQ, etc. But what you won't see is the wealth basically filtering to the entire economy. What you will create is, a new crop of African billionaires. And this is what we've seen in America. That's what we've seen, for instance, in China. I've seen that in India as well. The one difference is that in places like China, they don't just rely on the IP, the tech hub, the startup culture. They rely on manufacturing. And the great thing about manufacturing is it absorbs a large number of people, and not only people that have specialized skills. You train people to do the manufacturing you want to. So it's not just about building the most fancy cars up front, but you start off building whatever, toasters and irons and the simple stuff. And basically that absorbs a large number of workers. It's much more efficient when it comes to, spreading wealth around an economy. You can see that example between India and China. China has, these massive manufacturing hubs, and they do have some tech hubs as well, Alibaba, Tencent, etc. India focused on places like Bangalore with their tech hubs, with the startup culture, emphasis and so on. And India was successful. There are quite a number of, Indian billionaires. But what you don't have in India, what we had in China was you don't have that creation of a middle class based on manufacturing. Because, like I said, high-tech, innovation will work. You've got the brain power. There's enough people here to do that. But what it won't do will be a cure for inequality. What it won't do is basically, push 1 billion people out of poverty.
All right, now, Viv, how then do we grab the fourth industrial revolution in the context of definitively grabbing or taking advantage of the data boom or glut, as it were?
Yeah, look, it's going to be difficult. Places like the US are talking about things like, universal income, because they honestly are thinking about the possibility that, as new technology comes into play, a substantial percentage of the population of the country won't be employable in that new economy. And therefore, they're talking about basically, taxing Facebook. And, there's a guy called Andrew Yang in the US right now. He's like number 5th and number 6th rank on the Democratic platform. And he's basically pushing this universal basic income based on that idea. And there's a lot of talk around that in the developed world. It's going to be quite difficult for Africa to basically try and absorb, the amount of people that it needs to absorb. We're talking about, like I said, over 2 billion people. And it's, almost doubling the population between now and 2050. That is a huge number of new workers entering the workforce. They will not be absorbed by the fourth industrial revolution, innovation kind of stuff. They would need to be absorbed by more old-fashioned kind of manufacturing jobs. The fourth industrial revolution is defined by high connectivity, by automation, by artificial intelligence, generally things that are meant to replace workers as opposed to things that are meant to augment their productivity in most cases. And if we are entering a phase in which the fourth industrial revolution is going to take off in the way they're talking about, with driverless cars, with artificial intelligence, replacing a lot of analytical jobs, with robotics and automation in factories, it's going to be a real tough challenge. The one thing we do have as an advantage, as I mentioned before, is the fact that we have a huge market that's growing in Africa. We need to take advantage of that market and build off it like the Chinese did. The Chinese basically, tech companies started off from the idea of selling to China. That's why we have a Baidu. That's why we have a Tencent. And that's why we have an Alibaba. And Amazon and Facebook and Google don't have the imprint in China that they do in other parts of the world. Why? Because the Chinese basically use their 1.5 billion plus market, and they use that market to basically create their own internal hubs and their own internal demand to such. We can do that. But like I said, it's going to be very difficult to basically use the fourth industrial revolution to pick over 1 billion people out of poverty.
Well, just in closing, Viv, we see South Africa, particularly Pretoria and Joburg, literally burning, and as a result of the looting spree that has been going on, targeting particularly the foreign-owned shops. And we've seen one person dying, even though it hasn't been confirmed as yet whether that has been linked to the ongoing looting. So how will that at all affect the smooth, operation of the World Economic Forum, particularly those delegates from the different countries who will be descending to South Africa?
Look, it's not a great advertisement for the country. There's no way to basically refute that. This is a terrible time for this kind of stuff to be happening, beyond just, of course, the human tragedy. Like I said, you said a person died, etc. And, of course, the people who have lost, their shops and, will be looted and so on. But, I think this is also an indicator of the economic distress that people are feeling. That's one of the things we've been seeing. It's not just a local phenomenon. We can talk about Brexit, we can talk about Trump, we can talk about the rise of the far right in places like Italy and Germany, in France as well. And the reason for these things happening is because economic instability, people are fearful of the future, people are fearful about, where they're going to be placing in this new economic environment, losing jobs, not having jobs, etc. And that's just a thing that we have to basically handle in South Africa. With low economic growth rates, with growth rates that are below the population growth rate is. Tomorrow we get the GDP number for South Africa. Hopefully it's positive when we avoid a technical recession. But with growth rates that are low as they are, people are basically under pressure, and they need to lash out of wherever they think is, advancing, ahead of them in line, etc. And like I said, this is not a South African issue. You can see the similar thing in the US, in Europe, in parts of Asia as well. This is something similar has happened. And so we need to basically be cognizant of the fact that, yes, we want to basically have people, not behave in this manner, but the root cause of it is probably economic distress that we have to solve this long term.
All right, Viv, we thank you for your time and your insights and your reflections on this matter. That was Economist Viv Govender joining us via Skype. This is The Globe on SABC News. We'll have more in a moment.